week 2 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I would start and sit this week. So to the start of things, to start it off, Brandon Aiyuk coming off a monster ball game in week 1, over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And that is a pretty good matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams, even though their defense did play pretty well in week 1 versus the Seattle Seahawks in Seattle. But anyway, Brandon Aiyuk and Purdy, they've had this rapport going since last season when Purdy was the starting quarterback. And once again this week, I think Aiyuk, he puts up good numbers and definitely a wide receiver to start. The next wide receiver is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. I know Higgins, he had 8 targets, but a goose egg on the scoreboard for fantasy owners last week. But I think he bounces back. Big division game already here week 2 with the Baltimore Ravens coming to town. And we know Higgins is a talented wide receiver, and him and Jamar Chase both had bad ball games. And I think they're both going to have good games in this one. The Bengals, we know they always get off to a slow start. And after a bad week 1 here, I think Higgins, he's motivated to have a good week 2. And he could take care of that secondary a little bit, I think, as well in this one. So I have him as a start this week. The next receiver is Mike Williams of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Mike Williams, he left that ball game in week 1 for a little bit versus the Dolphins. What a head issue. But he came back and played pretty decent towards the end of the game, finishing with 8.5 fantasy points in PPR league. So Mike Williams, we know he's a deep ball threat. And this week here, Chargers, they got a pretty solid matchup at the Tennessee Titans, where I think they're going to have to move the ball a lot throughout the air. And especially if Austin Eckler's out in this game, that's going to take away some of the passes that go to Eckler, where Joshua Kelly's more of a running back than a guy who's going to catch a ball out of the backfield. So with all those factors, and Mike Williams, a big play wide receiver, and this Charger team trying to get into the win column, I think this week Williams is a wide receiver to start. The next receiver is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So a great start for Zay Flowers to kick off his career here. And he had over 15 fantasy points in week 1 as Zay Flowers. So him and Lamar Jackson already have a good chemistry in his first ball game of his career. He outsnapped Odell Beckham, Rashard Bateman, Devin Duvernay on this offense. And he looks like the main number 1 wide receiver out of the gate. And they even used him as a gadget guy on a few plays as well. So right now the volume is going to be there. The snap count's going to be there. And like I said, I'm ready for him and Lamar to have good chemistry early in the season. It's a good thing. And he's taking on a Cincinnati Bengals secondary that is middle of the pack type of defense. So right here, Zay Flowers already moving up the ranking board quickly early in the season here. And he's a start for me. The next receiver is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. So Lockett, he had a bad game in week 1. And that's what you're going to get with Lockett. But when it's all said and done, year in and year out, he is a 1,000-yard receiver, is Tyler Lockett. In week 1, he only had 4 fantasy points, but I think he bounces back here versus the Detroit Lions in a potential shootout. And we saw these two teams last season go at it, where it was a high-scoring game up and down the field with both teams. So right now, Lockett, I think, versus a mediocre Detroit secondary, has a good ball game. It wouldn't be surprising me if he has 50, 60 yards and finds the end zone. And after a bad week, I like to start some of these guys on a bounce back, and I think that's what we'll see here with Lockett in week 2. The next receiver is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Waddle, he had a mid-ball game for his standards in week 1, where he had 4 catches for 78 yards. So right now, Tyreek Hill, we know he went over 200 yards. And this is a very dynamic and explosive Miami Dolphin offense. And right now, they're going to verse Bill Belichick and those New England Patriots here. So right now, Tua, he's looked good so far. As long as Tua is healthy, this offense is going to roll and put up points week in and week out. So Jalen Waddle, we know he's a breakaway receiver. We know he can go out there, run all the routes, make the big plays. And I think in this one, Belichick, he's going to try to take Tyreek Hill away. So we're going to see more targets and more passes go Jalen Waddle's way. And I think he could have another nice ball game this week, where it wouldn't be surprising me if he could score 15, 20 fantasy points. And a start this week, Mike Evans as well, another start this week. Evans last week found the end zone, and him and Baker Mayfield had pretty good chemistry, surprisingly. Last season, Evans, I know he had 1,000 yards, but it was very tough for him to get there last year with Tom Brady. They weren't in sync. Evans wasn't always 100% as well, and he dropped a decent amount of passes. But so far in week 1 versus the Minnesota Vikings, a very good ball game for Mike Evans. And right here, week 2, pretty good matchup in Tampa Bay's home opener versus the Chicago Bears. We just saw Jordan Love gash that secondary up, and Romeo Doubs have a big fantasy day. So right now, contract year for Evans. Him and Baker on the same page so far, and a good matchup. Definitely a wide receiver to start this week, and the final receiver I would start DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So I know DJ Moore week 1, he didn't do anything with only 4.5 fantasy points. But right now, I think this is a good bounce back scenario here for DJ Moore. We just saw the wide receivers over there in Minnesota, Jefferson go over 100 yards in that one. Jordan Addison find the end zone. And I think DJ Moore, he could bounce back after the bad performance. And they traded for him for a reason. He has this bad team. So they got to find ways to get him the ball. They got to find ways to get this offense down the field better. He is the Chicago Bear team after the Packers pretty much shut down that offense for the most part. So I think Moore is a bounce back guy. And his start this week is pretty good. Now to the sit at the wide receiver position. Hollywood Brown. It's a tough offense this season. It's going to be with Joshua Dobbs at quarterback. I know Dobbs, he's only been there a few weeks, and he don't really know the playbook. But right now, Hollywood Brown, he's not a guy I'm going to have confidence in going into the week as a start. And there's better, younger wide receivers right now. I'd rather put in my starting lineup than Hollywood Brown. So right now, after a pretty much pedestrian week 1 for Brown, I expect a little bit more of the same here in week 2, even though they're versing a young Giants secondary with 2 corners that are rookies. But still, it's going to be tough for Owens to go out there and put Brown in the lineup. Next sits George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So George Pickens, we know he's a big play receiver. We know he could go out there and he could catch some crazy balls. But now with Deontay Johnson out here, George Pickens, he's going to be the number 1. And in this ball game, it's going to be a tough matchup for George Pickens, most likely with Denzel Ward on him in this ball game. And we just saw the Browns shut out T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase didn't do much in that ball game. So right now with a tough matchup versus the Browns, him and Pickett not always on the same page. And with Denzel Ward most likely covering Pickens the majority of the ball game, he's a guy I'm going to steer away from in this one. And he's a bench this week. The next guy's Traylon Burks of the Tennessee Titans. It's tough to trust any receiver besides maybe Hopkins on this wide receiving crew over here for this Tennessee Titan team. So Traylon Burks, we know he's got big play potential. We know he had a good college football career. But right here, him and Ryan Tannehill, it just seems like these 2 guys aren't really on the same page most weeks here. And right now, I know it's a mediocre matchup here in week 2 for Traylon Burks. Los Angeles Chargers coming to town. But after what we saw in week 1, where he pretty much didn't do anything throughout the air, and I know he had a rush attempt in that ball game, he's not really a guy I have confidence in. And this Tennessee Titan offense as a whole, it's pretty much tough to own many of these players on this team, besides maybe a Derrick Henry and a Hopkins, like I mentioned. Next sits Kadarius Toney of the Kansas City Chiefs. Toney with a horrible ball game with some bad drops, and he pretty much cost the Chiefs getting in field goal range late in that ball game and winning on the season opener. So right now, Toney, we know he's had injury concerns throughout his career. We know he's coming off another injury with the knee injury, and then all the bad drops, and he looked like one of the worst receivers in this receiving core for this Kansas City Chiefs team. So Toney's definitely a wide receiver I can't trust, obviously, here going into week 2. I know the matchup's pretty decent versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is a mid-defense in the secondary, but I'm steering clear pretty much of all Chiefs in this ball game, besides maybe, obviously, Travis Kelce if he plays, and Rashee Rice as a deep sleeper. Next receiver is Juju Smith-Schuster of the New England Patriots. Smith-Schuster, he didn't do much in week 1. It was pretty much Kendrick Bourne and Hunter Henry is the main guys over there. I know it was a tough matchup versus a good Philadelphia Eagles secondary, but it's a pretty decent matchup versus the Dolphins. But Keenan Allen, he didn't really have a huge ball game in week 1 of Mike Williams. And I don't see Juju doing much in this one as well versus the Miami Dolphins, where I think in this one, Patriots, they're going to stick to the tried and true, running the football with Stevenson, him getting a decent amount of catches out of the backfield, working Zeke in as well. And Mac Jones, we know his favorite targets throughout the last few years have been a Kendrick Bourne and a Hunter Henry. So right now, I see those guys having more production once again this week here than Juju. And at this point, he's pretty much a depth guy on your bench. And a sit this week. Next sit's Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So Drake London, I wasn't big on him coming into the year. It's not a Drake London issue. It's more that he don't really have a quarterback that's capable in Desmond Ridder of being consistent and getting to football to his playmakers, like a Kyle Pitts, obviously, like I mentioned in other videos. And now Drake London, who had the goose egg in week 1. And now here in week 2, a pretty good secondary coming to town with the Green Bay Packers. Yeah, Alexander, who most likely will cover Drake London for a majority of this ball game. So with all those factors, with bad quarterback play, tough matchup versus the Green Bay Packers, and in week 1, it was a nice position to be in versus the Panthers, and he did nothing. He's not a wide receiver I really can trust, and he's a sit this week. Next receiver is Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills. So Gabe Davis, I know a few years ago in the playoffs, he had that monster game versus the Kansas City Chiefs, but that seems like a long time ago now. And he pretty much hasn't done anything for fantasy owners over the last season. And then we saw it again on Monday Night Football versus the Jets, a pedestrian ball game, only 6.5 fantasy points. And him and Josh Allen just aren't on the same page, and he's not really getting the job done. So Gabe Davis, yes, he could have a pop game here and there, but he's going to be an inconsistent wide receiver 4 or 5 for the majority of the season for fantasy owners. Right now, even though in a pretty decent matchup versus the Raiders, he's not a receiver I could trust. And a guy I'm sitting this week, and the final wide receiver I'm going to sit is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So his snaps went down a lot in that ball game. I know they're versing the Kansas City Chiefs in this one, where their secondary is passable on in this ball game, where Kirk could bounce back and put up numbers. But right now, Zay Jones outsnapped him. Calvin Ridley, we know he's the true number one wide receiver over there in Jacksonville after one game going over 100 yards. And even Evan Ingram had a better ball game as well. So right now, coming off a bad ball game, and with the snaps going down here for Christian Kirk, he's going to be, once again, I think, an inconsistent guy like he is Kirk in his Arizona Cardinal days. Wide receiver start sit for week 2 of the fantasy football season.